All right, so it's showtime. Let's talk about the actual interview itself. Parts of an interview. So typically an interview starts out with small talk and introductions, questions, both theirs and yours, and then there's usually some sort of a closing. So my advice to you with regard to small talk and introductions, sometimes those conversations can happen right there in the lobby, in the waiting room. Sometimes those conversations are happening en route to the interview room. My advice there is to keep it simple. Keep the conversation simple, keep the communication simple. Stay away from controversial topics. So something could come up, somebody could ask you something like, what do you think of the upcoming election? This is not the time to get into your political views, but they might tempt you with that. My suggestion in responding to this might simply be to say, this is one of the most important elections that I can remember in my lifetime. It's certainly going to be interesting. So what you've done with that sort of response is you've responded to the question, but you've stayed away from sharing your particular political views. Again, we don't know if they align or not, and that's really not important. The next part of an interview is going to be questions, their questions. Almost always your interviewer will ask you open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are questions that typically don't have a yes or no response. You're often going to have to give a little bit more detail. They might ask you questions about your opinion. They might ask you hypothetical questions. What would you do if? They might ask you more questions about your qualifications. They're most certainly going to ask you behavioral questions from my experience. Behavioral questions ask you about behavior in the past. Tell us about a time when, because that's often one of the best predictors of future behavior. I'm excited to share with you one of my very favorite interviewing techniques, especially when it comes to behavioral interviewing, and it's called the STAR interviewing technique. You might be familiar with it, but let me explain. It's pretty easy to follow. So the S and the T, be sure to explain the situation or task. So if you're asked a question, explain the situation or task. Give them context so they can really see and follow moment to moment what was happening. You want to be sure to describe the action that you took. What did you do? It's great to describe the action that the group took, if it was a group sort of scenario you're explaining, but most definitely be sure to talk about what your role is or was. And finally, what was the result? Share the outcome. Did it go well? How did it end? So let's review a couple of scenarios, and I want you to tell me, are these STAR responses or where might they need some modification? So here's the question. Describe a time when you handled a customer complaint. Let's look at the first scenario or response. Let's see how they did. Again, the question is describe a time when you handled a customer complaint. So the first person says, I don't really have an example with a customer because this is my first job, but one time my team and I worked on a project together, and one of the team members was upset because he felt like he wasn't being communicated with about the project. We got an A, so it was all good in the end. So I want you to think about yourself. Remember the STAR technique. Describe the situation or task, the action you took, and the results that were achieved. Is this STAR? And I'm going to guess that some of you may have said yes, sort of, but a lot of you probably said no. And there's some things missing here. I don't think that this person did a really good job of setting the stage, sharing about what happened. I want to know more about why this person was upset. What do they mean when they say they weren't communicated with? What did the person say to them? They got an A, but there's something missing. The person was upset because they weren't being communicated with, but then they got an A. There's a lot of things in between that I feel like I'm just not getting. Let's take a look at the second scenario. When I was working at Starbucks over this past summer, a customer approached the counter and was upset because his coffee was lukewarm. Normally, our manager handles customer complaints. However, this time the manager was on break. I decided to remake the coffee for the customer and provided the customer with a coupon for a discount next time he returned. When my manager returned from break, I explained the situation. She complimented me for handling the situation appropriately and swiftly. Is this a STAR response? I'm going to guess that you agree with me, and it is. So they did a really great job of describing the situation or task, the action they took. They provided that customer with a new coffee, they provided them with a coupon, and then they went so far as to tell us how things ended. What was the result? That manager was pleased with the work that they did. So to me, that's a great example of a star response. Now, I'm going to guess that with this second response, this person probably thought of that scenario in advance. They were thinking about a time when they had to work on their feet or a time when they had to deal with conflict. So preparation is everything. So here are some impressive questions that you might ask. Can you tell me what a typical day might look like in this position? What are you hoping this person will accomplish in their first 6 months on the job? How would you describe the culture here? What kind of people have really thrived in this role? What do you like most about working here? I have to say, people really enjoy talking about themselves and their experience, especially if they're happy there. It's a great way to build rapport in an interview. You might ask something specific about the job or the organization that you really want to know. Maybe there was something that came up in the interview that they mentioned that you want to know more about. Maybe you want to know more about the timeline. What are their next steps? Maybe there's other questions. But I want to ask you, what do you think? Is it ever okay to not ask a question? If they ask you, do you have any questions for us? What do you think? So I'm going to say no. You should always have questions prepared. My suggestion is that you think of some things in advance. You should walk in the door with a list of questions. What would be wonderful is if all of your questions got asked during the interview before you even had a chance to ask them. But what I would suggest, if you freeze, if you really can't think of any questions, again, hopefully you've prepared some, but you might say, I had a few questions about the organizational culture or about the position, but you all have done a really nice job here of answering those for me. So I don't have any additional questions other than the timeline for the position. So do you see, you don't ever want to seem like you're uninterested or disinterested, and it can come across that way with no questions. All right, closing the interview. So the close of an interview can actually be really important. You have a chance to do what's called recover. So sometimes in interviews, there are moments that don't quite go as well as we want them to go. Perhaps you said something that in hindsight, it didn't come out very well, or you wanted to give a little bit more information about something. Take this opportunity to do that and be really forward about it. So as the interview is closing, you might say something about, when I was speaking about my Starbucks position, I neglected to mention this, or I said something that I felt like could have been a little bit misleading. I want to have a chance to clarify. Or perhaps when you were talking about your education, you neglected to mention a particular award that you won. Take the opportunity to recover, recontextualize things, add additional information as you see fit. You want to ask if there's any additional information you can provide. Sometimes there might be something that they're pondering or they have a question, and you inviting them to ask that might actually be just what they need. So they come out with another question, you have a chance to clarify something that they were wondering about. Reiterate your interest. Don't leave them wondering where you stand. This is your chance to share your enthusiasm about the position and about the organization. Reiterate your skills and ensure that you have an understanding of what the next steps are going to be. Follow-up. Interview follow-up. So it's still great practice to write a thank you note within 24 hours. And of course, these days, email communication is very appropriate. The same person that extended the interview to you is the same person you're going to want to follow up with. If you were able to get additional contact information during the interview, you might go ahead and send all of those folks an email. Or you might ask the hiring manager that you were working with to share your email with the other committee members. That would be perfectly fine. But typically within 24 hours is still appropriate. Follow up 24 hours after they said you would hear back. Again, hopefully you didn't leave the interview without a clear vision of what the next steps were going to be. 24 hours after they said you'd hear back, follow up. Again, things happen. People get busy. They may not always be able to get back to you right at that moment, but give them an additional 24 hours and then definitely follow up. If they didn't give a timeline or their timeline was unclear, I suggest following up within a week and then follow up 1 week after that if there's still no response. All right, as a bonus, as promised, I have some additional interview and etiquette tips for you. Additional tips and etiquette. I want you to know that questions about race, gender, age, religion, marital status, sexual orientation, and those kinds of very personal things are not okay. You might just respond with, I'm not sure that's relevant to the application, and stand your ground. Be comfortable, leave it at that. If you're getting a lot of these kinds of questions during an interview, you might ask yourself, is this the kind of organization that I want to work for? Tip number 2, treat everyone you encounter with respect. The groundspeople, the guard, the receptionist, everyone. You'd be surprised at the number of people that have chased after me to say, hey, did you interview that woman that I saw this morning? She was so kind to me. She just was so pleasant. Those kinds of things go a long way. Be kind to everyone. You never know who knows someone. Do not ever speak negatively about your previous employers. If someone is speaking negatively about their employer, chances are you're going to speak negatively about this employer. It's just in bad taste. Figure out how to, if you've left a job and you didn't leave things so well, or they left a bad taste in your mouth, practice how you're going to respond talking about that. You never want to speak poorly of your supervisor or the organization that you previously worked for. Do not tell a lie or mistruth. If it didn't happen, don't share it. Everything that you share, whether on your resume or in an interview, needs to be verifiable. Be honest. Again, be looking for connections, things that are not explicit that you've done, but might be connected to the job. Again, it's your responsibility to figure out how you're going to connect your experience, your skills with that of the job description. But you don't need to lie about it. Be as honest as possible. Connect with your audience by using eye contact, stating their names in response to their questions whenever possible. I'll share with you one time I was in an interview and it was a round table, and the applicant was actually sitting sort of awkwardly. I was sitting sort of awkwardly to her right. And again, it was an awkward situation, but she attempted to give many people in the room eye contact. I never got eye contact from the candidate. And I have to say, it was really difficult for me to establish a rapport with that candidate. And it ended up being an impact. It was a factor in whether or not she was able to move on to the next level of interviewing. So keep in mind, you've got to be able to connect with every single person in the room, even the person who might be awkwardly placed to your left or awkwardly placed to your right. Be sure that to engage everyone. Your friends and family should be out of sight when you're interviewing. I can't tell you how important this is. Again, maybe you've arranged a ride. That's completely fine. Talk to that person in advance about what the details are going to be. Your interview is expected to end at 2 o'clock. I'll text you when I'm finished. Your interview behavior is a good example of the kind of employee that you're going to be. So if you have somebody who's waiting in the lobby with you, I might think that you're the kind of person who has friends hanging out at work. Maybe that's not true, but I might think that. It's best to tone down perfume and cologne. You know, we're in a day and age where people have allergies in the workplace. And so be mindful, be sensitive of that. Also, you want to be remembered for your interview, what you have to offer and contribute to the organization, not the fragrance that you're wearing. Silence is only awkward if you make it awkward. Let's face it, interviewing can be awkward and uncomfortable. Take moments to pause if you need them. If you need silence for a second to think about something, think about it. Everyone else in the room, I promise you, is fine. The only time that anyone else in the room gets uncomfortable is if you start to get uncomfortable and start to think, oh my gosh, I can't think of the answer to that. It's perfectly okay to be silent and think for a moment. Be human, not perfect. It's always okay to express your excitement or even your nervousness and move on. As you're thinking about your first question, you might be nervous and you might be pausing and you might say, you know what, I'm actually really excited to be here. Can I just acknowledge that right now? I wanted to get that out. And just move on. People will appreciate you emphasizing how excited you are about the position. It's okay to pause, take a moment, ask for clarification when needed. Interviewing is sometimes stressful. I've said that many times throughout this presentation. Take a moment, take the time that you need, ask for clarification, make sure you're responding to the right question. Pause, Everyone in the room, again, is comfortable as long as you are. And finally, I want to say stay ready so you don't have to get ready. All of this research stuff that I was talking about, all of this preparation, if you're in interviewing mode, stay ready, know what your skills are. Interview questions, about teamwork, conflict, working under pressure, you should be able to respond to those pretty readily. Stay ready, stay prepared. You never know. You don't always have, 2 weeks to prepare for an interview. Sometimes you have 24 hours or 36 hours. So be as prepared as possible. When you're in interview mode, again, you should be able to respond to questions about who you are and those core areas that we talked about that are almost always asked. You should be ready to respond to those questions. All right, so that concludes our interviewing essentials workshop.